Raise your hand if you saw that there was only one flat in that song. Raise your hand if you just lied about seeing the flat in the song. We're going to talk about a man named Gideon. In our study of all the men and women of the Bible, Gideon is one of my favorite of the judges. There's only one other judge that is probably more interesting to talk about, and that's obviously Samson. But short of Samson, Gideon is the other one who is really, I guess, probably emphasized more than any of the others. Gideon and Samson are kind of the two. We already talked about Deborah and Barak and their situation, but even theirs is not as detailed as we get to see Gideon and Samson. So Gideon, other than being a judge, he was the 5th judge of Israel, but his legacy really is being the judge who would deliver them from Midian after God continued to test him by repeatedly decreasing the size of his army until it consisted of only 300 men. That's just my take on Gideon's legacy. And by legacy, I just mean the thing that he's probably most remembered by in the minds of Bible students. So that's who he is. He is the one who God kept whittling down his army until there were only 300 left. So that's who Gideon is. And the story, the account of his call and his ministry, if you want to call it that, as judge, is pretty fascinating. It's full of stuff, full of interesting things. Not the least of which, so Judges chapter 6 through 8 is where we find this. He's called the man of might and valor, as we'll see. But the beginning of Judges 6 sort of sets up what's going on. Remember the judges cycle, as we call it. The people of Israel would be faithful. God would bless them. Then they would, over time, become unfaithful. Then God would raise up a foreign nation to come and oppress them until they repented. And once they finally repented and cried out to God, he would raise up a judge, a military leader, to rise up and destroy the oppressor. So in Judges 6, it's Midian. We read that the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of Jehovah, and Jehovah gave them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. So Midian was really causing them stress. Whenever they planted crops, the Midianites would come and take them, come up against them and take them. This was the setting. It says the people of Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and they cried out for help from Jehovah. That's verse 6. And down in verse 11, then, we get the call of Gideon. Now, here's what's interesting about Gideon's situation, circumstances. It says, the angel of Jehovah came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. There's a detail there that you might look over. You could easily read over that and not even skip a beat. But when you go back and think about what you just read, there's something that sounds strange in there. Anybody notice anything strange other than the angel of Jehovah sitting under a tree? Okay, he's beating out wheat in the winepress. Now, I'm no expert. I've never beat out wheat in my life, okay? I wouldn't know what to do. And I wouldn't know where to do it. But I tell you one place that even now I would probably know that you don't do it, and that's in the winepress, because that doesn't even make sense. Why is Gideon beating out wheat in the winepress? Well, the text tells us it's to hide it from the Midianites. The last place they would expect to find wheat is in the winepress. Now, eventually they might catch on to something and go look. But we might say that presents Gideon as cowardly, maybe, at least careful, I guess, to say the least. He's He's beating out wheat in the winepress because he's afraid of the Midianites. He doesn't want the Midianites to come and take it, or worse. But this is when the angel of Jehovah appeared to him. And the way that he addresses him may come as a shock to the reader, but it comes as a shock to Gideon, it seems. He says, Jehovah is with you, O mighty man of valor. Now, up to this point, we've just met Gideon. We don't know anything he's done. We don't have any reason to believe that he's done anything of might, anything mighty or anything of valor. But he calls him a mighty man of valor. Another thing that I love about this account of Gideon is the questions that he asks the angel of Jehovah. Because I think they're questions that any Christian today could find themselves asking. Here's what he asked. Number one, if Jehovah is with us, then why is all this happening? You don't have to admit it, but there's a pretty good chance that there's some point in your life, even if it was just a fleeting moment, that you have wondered that same exact thing. Why is this happening to me, to us, to them, to anybody that is, a child of God? If God is with us, why is this happening? That's question number one. Number two is, even more so, I think, likely to be asked by Christians today, where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us? For instance, bringing us up out of Egypt and so on. But now Jehovah has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian. So where are all the big, amazing things that God has done? Where are those things? Why is that significant? Well, it's significant to me because Gideon lived in a time that we, from our perspective, would think, maybe erroneously think, God was going around doing miracles left and right and everywhere all the time. God did miracles back then. And we might wish that we lived in a time when God was doing miracles. And yet, even all the way back in Judges chapter 6, which if you look at how much of your Bible exists before Judges 6 compared to after Judges 6, this is pretty early. Even then, Gideon's thinking the same thing that you may have thought before. Where are all the amazing, wonderful things? From our perspective, where are all the things that we we read about that God did? Even Gideon, in the time of the judges, felt that same way. But was God on vacation? Nope. He hadn't stopped. But from Gideon's perspective, it seemed like God was retired or something. Where are all his wonderful deeds? So that just has always struck me as, man, that sounds an awful lot like something that people today might ask. Like, we read about these amazing things. Where are they now? Well, God is still not retired, even though it may seem like things are different. They are different because they seem different because they are different, but at least not in God's interest or activity. Joe, do you have something?
Well, it seems to me the way it's written, Gideon was looking to save food for the Israelites. That's why he was hiding where he was gleaning the wheat and the winepress. And the concept is, I'm doing all this work, where are you? In other words, notice the mighty man of valor. And he wonders, he's kind of making fun of him. In all your life, I did this.
Yeah.
And he repeats it again. It's an interesting conversation.
Yes, because the picture doesn't look like a mighty man of valor. He's in the winepress hiding from the Midianites with the wheat. But, yeah, in verse 14 he says, and by the way, this is also a very strong example that shows that the angel of Jehovah is Jehovah. Because if you compare verse 12 of verse 14 and verse 16, in verse 12, the angel of Jehovah is speaking to him, but in verse 14, Jehovah is speaking to him. And in verse 16, Jehovah is speaking to him. So some versions might say the angel of Jehovah, the angel of the Lord in verse 14, but even those, as far as I understand, don't say that in verse 16. So, well, was it the angel of the Lord speaking to him, or was it the Lord speaking to him? Yes, is the answer, because the angel of the Lord is the Lord. And this is not the only place that is shown. The burning bush is another one of those. But anyway, this is God calling Gideon to be the next judge, the next deliverer for God's people. He says, I will be with you, and here we see Gideon's humility. How can I save Israel? Verse 15, my clan's the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my father's house. What am I supposed to do? Why do you think I can do that? You're calling me? You got the wrong guy, maybe, Gideon seemed to think. How can I save Israel? I'm among the lowest men in the lowest clan, in the lowest tribe of my father's. I'm the least in my father's house and of the weakest clan. But God said, you're forgetting something, Gideon. I'm going to be with you. And we will win. We will be victorious. But then Gideon, another thing that's fascinating about is how patient God is with Gideon. When you turn to the New Testament, Jesus did not view it kindly whenever somebody said, okay, show us a sign so we know that you're telling the truth. But God here with Gideon's very patient, very gentle, and very understanding. Because Gideon says, show me a sign that it is really you that's speaking with me. And so he did. He showed him a sign. Then he's still not done asking for signs. But he did show him a sign here. And I guess that was good enough for now. And what we end up reading is Gideon took, actually we read that he built an altar there and called it Jehovah is Peace. And he took 10 men of his servants and did as Jehovah had told him, but because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. There's his carefulness again. He was going to do it, but he was too afraid to break down these altars of Baal in the daytime, so he's going to do it at nighttime. Okay, well, I guess God didn't tell him to do it in the daytime, so he's technically still doing what God told him to do, which is recorded in verses 28 and following. So Gideon destroys the altar of Baal. We can't blame him for being a little afraid because that was probably a big deal. And here we learn, incidentally, that his family were idolaters. And he was going to destroy the altars on which they worshipped Baal and their gods. And he did it anyway. That's why he got a new name. Jerubbaal. Which, according to the text, means let Baal contend against him. So it's not a name that's honoring Baal. It's a name that's looking down on Baal. He is the defeater of Baal. The implication is Baal cannot contend against Gideon because Gideon defeated him. So, after all this is when we see God's patience really played out. Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, I got another sign for you to do. The fleece. He said, I've got this fleece of wool here. I'm going to lay it out. If in the morning there is dew on the fleece and no dew on the ground, then I will know that you're going to save Israel by my hand. He's trying to make deals with God. Normally that probably wouldn't go too well for some people, or we might expect. But with Gideon, God goes along with it, shockingly. He rose up in the next day, and voila, there's dew on the fleece, no dew on the ground. But that still wasn't enough for Gideon. Now he's really testing the waters. And he knows he's doing that because here's what he says. God, please don't let your anger burn against me. Don't get mad. Let me just speak one more time. Let me test just once more with the fleece. I'm going to swap it around now. Now, tomorrow morning, if the fleece is dry and there's dew all over the ground, then I'll really know. So God did it. Not a word of rebuke. God was patient and long-suffering with Gideon, and he may have gotten a little lucky here, because I get it. God had every right to say, you know what, I've changed my mind. I'm going to go pick somebody else. But he didn't. He did as Gideon asked. Probably a lesson in that. Well, the next thing we read is the infamous 300 ordeal in chapter 7. Gideon's legacy, as far as I described it. So it says that he had all of his men. It doesn't say exactly how many here, but what we do read is that God said, got too many men. Now we learn a few verses down that there were 32,000. 32,000 men. God says, yeah, too many. Too many men. Now I didn't know there was such a thing as too many men. When you're talking about getting an army to go fight another army, isn't that a good thing? Too many men's a good thing. Remember Elisha and his servant? They got more men than we do. We're in big trouble. That's a good thing when you have more men. Well, God says, you have too many. Too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand. But what was his reasoning? Because Israel might think they did it on their own. And because you had so many men. So he says, what I want you to do is announce that every man who's afraid can go home. So he says, okay, everybody, if you're afraid, you can go on home. I don't know what Gideon expected to happen from this. He might have expected, nobody's going to admit they're afraid. We're talking about soldiers here. And, you know, everybody would be looking at each other like, I ain't going to say it. I'm not saying it. I'm kind of scared, but I ain't going to say it. But what he found was 22,000 of them went home. So now he's only got 10,000 men. God said, still got too many. Hate to break it to you, buddy. Still got too many. Now he's down to 10,000. He devises another test. It's kind of confusing, and there are differences of opinion on what exactly was being done and what it meant. But the test was, you're going to go over to this water and, separate the men who lap the water from those who kneel down to drink the water. That's sort of the easiest way I can describe it. So some went down on their knees and put their mouths to the water and sucked up the water they needed. And others stooped down and took water up in their hands and drank it out of their hands like that, which is probably what I would have done if I was there. What's the difference? Well, if there is any significance in the difference, the point is God said, the ones who lapped it up from their hands, that's your army. And again, for whatever the difference was, there's different schools of thought, it happened to be only 300 men. 300 of the 10,000, which is kind of shocking, but at any rate, that's what it was. Whichever ones lapped it up from their hands, that's your army, and it was 300. The question that, people naturally are going to ask is, Why did he want those? Was it just because it was a smaller number, or was there significance in the lapping up from the hands? Some suggest the reason they did it from their hands is because they were afraid, and they didn't want to be off their guard. So, you drink it from your hands, you can kind of be looking around. You put your face down in the water, you're kind of making yourself a little too vulnerable. Whether that's the case or not is irrelevant. It may just be that there were only 300 that did that, so God said that's the men that's going to be your army. I think the reason some people try to make it significant that they did it from their hands is to make the point even stronger. Not only was it just 300, but it was the 300 that were the most fearful of the 10,000 left. But, that may be one of those things where trying to make a point where the point's already been made. The real point God is trying to make is, all I need is 300. And you know what? God didn't even really need 300. You know how many God really needed? 0. But God wasn't going to do it on his own. He didn't want them to do it on their own because he knew they couldn't. But he ain't going to do it on his own either. He wants them. They're going to do their part. But he's teaching a lesson all the while. So, long story short, they win. They win because they had God. Even though Gideon was naturally going to be a little nervous about, we had 32,000 and now you've taken it down to 300? This is a risk. Well, he learned pretty quickly that it's not a risk, because it's never a risk when you got God on your team. God wins. He can't lose. So, chapter 8 then, Gideon defeats some other people. He took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men of Succoth a lesson. Might call that a whip. Kind of an interesting picture there. He taught them a lesson with thorns of the wilderness and briars. He's becoming the mighty man of valor that God told him he was at the beginning, with God's help. Finally, a turn of events happens. Gideon, the people were so behind Gideon that they wanted him to be their king. But Gideon was smart enough to know that is not going to happen. This is not a good thing. He knew that beforehand. Later, obviously, Israel would demand it again, and they would get a king. But Gideon said, I will not rule over you, and my son won't rule over you either. Jehovah will rule over you because he's the king. Going good so far. But then he did something that had some adverse effects. And it's a sad sort of period at the end of his legacy in life. He made an ephod. He said, everybody give me some the earrings and other jewelry or whatever from the spoil, and spread them all. He spread them all out, and he took it and they melted it down, I guess, and they made this ephod and put it in his city, and it became an idol to the people. I think Gideon had the best of intentions. I don't really know what his intentions were because it doesn't say, but based on verses 22 and 23, I feel like it's better to give him the benefit of the doubt and think that he had good intentions. But what he apparently didn't anticipate was that all Israel was going to whore after it. And it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. And then we read about how he finally died. One of the biggest compliments, it's a sad state, but it is a compliment to him sort of in a backwards way. As soon as he died, the people of Israel turned back to the Baals and idols. It's unfortunate, tragic, but it does show how powerful Gideon's influence was. Just like when Joshua died and the elders that worked with Joshua died, the people instantly started to fall away from God. Now Gideon dies, the people instantly turn back to the idols that he had worked so valiantly to defeat. That's how he started, by destroying the altars of Baal and the Ashtoreth or the Asherah, whichever one, Asherah. And now, apparently his influence wasn't enough that after he died, the people were like, okay, well, we're going back. Sad. But that's Gideon, and we see humility, we see caution, plenty of that. We see spirituality, obedience, inspiration, divine fellowship, his strategy, his tact, his loyalty to God, and that he was weakened there at the end. Even with all these traits, he was still not immune to weakness and being overcome. Here are some lessons we can learn from Gideon. Today's coward can be tomorrow's hero. Maybe we shouldn't use a word as harsh as coward, but he does portray some timidness in the fact that he was in the wine press hiding it, but then also he wasn't going to do this in the daytime. He's going to wait till nighttime because he was afraid of his family, and yet he became a hero. He was fearful one day, hero the next day, so to speak. Yeah, Dean? Yeah. Yeah, they didn't want them growing their own stuff, because if you don't have your own stuff, guess what? You have to rely on them. A tactic government still, in some places and increasingly in here, wants to happen. But anyway, even though we may, the lesson here for us is, if I feel like I'm too timid or fearful to do what God expects me to do today, I don't have to stay this way. I don't have to make peace with the fact that this is just the way I am, and God made me this way, and so God will just have to deal with it. He shouldn't have made me this way if he wants me to do something that I don't want to do. No, that's not the way it works. Yep.
Don't you think the scripture could be as wise as serpents, but as harmless as doves, would apply in this case? He doesn't expect us to hide from reality here on earth. We can know what's going on, but never rely on it, rely on God. So that's what I see as shrewdness in what he was doing.
Yeah, at the beginning. Yeah, you mean it with the wheat. Yeah, he was high. It wasn't really a reflection on his faith in God, I don't guess. Somebody could make that point, that he should have trusted God, that God would look out for him. Of course, the problem with that is God was the one raising up the Midianites against them in the first place. But yes, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, and that goes to his strategy and his tact and being smart, but not in an evil way. That's kind of what Jesus meant when he said, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, as opposed to the other way around. We wouldn't think of serpents as harmless. So be wise as serpents, but in demeanor and in practicality, be harmless as doves, innocent as doves.
See, he missed last week, and the last time I was here, we were talking about Daniel. And here's Daniel in your face in the window, praying to God, healing God. So it's interesting that the two men responded differently.
Yeah, which is yeah. Are you sure that's the last time you were here?
I think so.
That was a long time ago. Yeah, well, your point is well taken. There is a contrast there, Daniel, and I guess we could discuss what was different, and there's a good good indication that faith may have been the difference. Daniel was not afraid because he had faith in God. Whatever happened, just like his three friends. Whether God saves us or not, we still ain't going to do what you're telling us to do because that would displease our God. Yep, Dean? Yeah. Yep. Okay. You're being nicer than I was then. So he was taking a risk, yeah. That's a fair point. Very fair point. Kind of going right along with that first lesson, second lesson, which we've seen this lesson. This has been a lesson in several of our characters here. Little people can do big things. You don't have to be the big, famous, rich, powerful, whatever, to be able to do great things. And that is maybe one of the biggest lessons from Gideon, not just as a man, but the whole situation of chapter 7 with the 300. Little armies can do big things too, little people. And that's a lesson that will continue to be repeated in some of the characters. I think that's a lesson that we can learn from every nameless character in the Bible. And there are many unnamed characters in the Bible that did big things. Yeah, David? Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of wonder if if this was announced to the 300 men, if some of those 300 were like, why did I drink the water like that? I should have drank it the other way. I don't know. There's plenty of unknowns here. But the main point is pretty clear as far as what God was up to, what he was doing. He makes it pretty clear. Okay, number 3, God is patient, merciful, kind, and reassuring. That goes back to Gideon. Talk about being brave. We see his bravery here. God, show me another sign. And then whenever he showed him that one, just one more. Just please one more, and then I'll be done. And to his credit, he was done, because he could have woke up that morning and said, I know I said just one more, but let me do just one more. But he didn't. And God was very patient with him. Number 4, God always wins. I already made that point, so there we go. It's a fact. God wins. And if you're on God's side, you get to win. There's the book of Revelation, right? Every bit of it right there. Just replace God with Jesus, and that's the book of Revelation. Number 5, we should think carefully about the potential consequences of our well-meaning actions, or our actions, period. Regardless of whether what Gideon did in chapter 8 near the end of his life, it seems, was utterly evil, or whether he meant well but it had negative effects, he should have maybe thought twice about maybe this isn't the best thing to do. But at any rate, he did it, and it became a big stumbling block to himself and to his family. In fact, it says all Israel whored after it. So even if he meant well, in hindsight, he shouldn't have done the thing that making that golden breastplate or whatever it was, and placing it in the city for everybody to, And number 6, the faithfulness of an entire people can depend on a single person. And what I mean by that is, like we pointed out, as soon as Gideon died, the people went. So in a sense, again, just like with Joshua and the elders, he was the one that was holding them all together in faithfulness, in spiritual well-being. It was him. Now, we made the point from one of the previous characters that good leaders make sure that there's a replacement for them whenever they're gone. Because Gideon, sadly, apparently there was nobody to take his place in that spiritual leadership role. And therefore, when he died, the people just went right back to Baal. And so the reason that could be an encouraging lesson for us is for us to try to be that person, that single person that can influence people enough to inspire in them faithfulness. If we all try to be that one person who is encouraging and leading people to greater faithfulness, then we'll be in pretty good shape, because then we don't just have a single person. We're all doing it for each other and together. But can't miss that point of, what about when we're gone? What's the state of the church when we're gone? And am I doing anything like Paul told Timothy? You need to preach this, but you need to give it to faithful men who will be able to teach it after you. And that process should go on and on and on, because as soon as that process ends, the spirituality plummets. The teaching isn't there anymore. So, a lesson to be learned for all time. Gideon, what'd you got? Something struck you, so enlighten us.
The last one, how do you qualify that with concept? When Samuel went to get David, and God said, you always look at people, their humanity, where God sees the heart. Whereas Timothy, all we can judge is the behavior of people. So we have to know they're faithful. Do you see what I'm saying? One said, you're not capable of judging. The other says, no, I expect you to judge. Either in this or two.
I don't really see them as the same concept. I mean, when he said that to Samuel, he was talking about their outward appearance. You look at the outward appearance. You can't tell somebody's faithful by their outward appearance. Huh? Yeah, but what they do, which is not what God was talking about to Samuel. He's talking about what they look like. Because he saw the sons, and he's like, oh, he must be the one God's talking about, because look at him, he just got that look. God's saying, stop looking at it the way they look. I look at the heart. Jesus said that we can see what's in somebody's heart. I'm paraphrasing, but by their fruits. You can judge a person by their fruits. So you can judge a person's, whether they're faithful, by their fruits. So it's not about their outward appearance, but it is about their outward actions, in a part of it at least, but not their outward, not strictly the way they look. Yeah. Yeah. That's the fruits. The opposite of that would be to look at somebody who may be perfectly faithful and truthful to the scriptures, but you are concerned about, they look, you just by your own standard, you're like, they look, You know, they might have a beard or something crazy like that. Curly hair, out of control. A T-shirt. Yeah, God made me this way. See, I already made that point. But he also made scissors and clippers, didn't he? Yeah. Anyway, I don't know what, I was going to comment on that, but somebody stole it from me, so it's gone. It's gone now, way gone. Lost in the curls, I guess, so.